I'm Teri Blauersouth. I am a clinical mental health therapist here locally. I work currently at a chemical dependency center, so I work at rehab. And because of that, it means mostly what I treat is actually trauma. And before I started there, I was doing in-home therapy, and again, mostly working with trauma. So I originally got interested in this subject because of an argument about Captain America's sex life. Might as well get that out of the way right off the bat. I got into an argument about Captain America's sex life, and being a nerd, I had to prove that I was right. So I started looking up psychological articles to prove my point, and to my shock, there weren't any that were addressing exactly my argument. So naturally, I did the only same thing and did a 40-page annotated with bibliography paper synthesizing the existing research to prove my point. That's what you would do, right? That's like a normal response to a situation like that.
You got it, good.
And as it turned out, that research really informed my practice of therapy, which I don't generally tell my clients. So clients that are watching this on YouTube, now you know. So what the subject really is about is, in fancy psych terms, what we call embodied psychology, which is basically the psychology of studying not just the mind, but the whole self. And the whole self involves the body. We are not heads in jars like on Futurama, or those even creepier heads in balls on that one episode of Doctor Who. That really creeped me out. And the reason that I study embodied psychology, there's several. The first one is that what we call the mind-body dichotomy is pretty much a crock. Okay, we sort of have this attitude in our culture that we're like brains, possibly souls, kind of piloting this meat mecca. As it turns out, research is all very clear that is not the case. Your psychological, your emotional, and your cognitive well-being, even your cognitive well-being, your ability to think straight, is all rooted in the body. When the body gets messed up, that affects everything that goes on here. Your brain's not separate from your body. It is, shock of shocks, actually part of your body. In case you couldn't figure that out by all the veins and nerves and things running between them. Okay. And I'm going to get into exactly why your body is so important for your emotional and cognitive and psychological well-being in a minute here. The other reason is that a lot of your identity is rooted in your body. Okay? Abstractly, we kind of know this. Like, I know that I look like this, and that's how people recognize me, and people respond to me in this body, and that's part of how people have interacted with me, so that becomes part of my identity. My identity is influenced by the way that people treat me, and the way that people treat me is influenced by my body. Not just how it looks, but also what can it do? Okay? Do I have any disabilities? That impacts how people interact with me, and that impacts my identity. We're social creatures. Okay, our identity is built through back and forth with other people. And my favorite reason, and I suspect the reason that got a lot of you in this room today, is that human beings, especially in the last century, are constantly finding new ways of surviving and thriving. The ways that we have of experiencing our bodies and surviving that and changing our bodies is multiplying constantly. If you just look at prosthetic technology alone, there is so much going on right now. Cyborgs. Yes, the world is full of actual cyborgs now. So part of why I wanted to study this is because, well, if I'm living in a world full of cyborgs, I guess I should know something about the psychology of cyborgs, shouldn't I? Being a therapist, that would be a good idea. I have lots of clients who are cyborgs. I do. I guess there's several cyborgs in this room. So I wanted to look at that because technology is expanding our ways of experiencing our bodies and expanding the things we can survive happening to our bodies. So we need to be knowing about what that does to our mind, especially if we're therapists. Okay, so that's great. That's why I'm studying embodied psychology. So why is this presentation about superheroes? Because that's kind of unintuitive. The first reason is that psychology kind of ignored the body for decades. For the most part. There was like a few rebellious therapists and research who were looking into it, but for the most part, we were treating people like brains in meat mecca. Okay? Superhero stories, on the other hand, have been dealing with embodied experiences the whole time. They've been having these conversations while the field of psychology as a whole was failing to. And because of that, superhero stories are absolutely drenched in embodied psychology experiences. They've been having this conversation, so it kind of seems to make sense that they get to be here when we actually talk about it properly in terms of fancy psychology words. The other thing is, a lot of those stories, although I've never met anyone who's turned into a giant rock mutant in my practice, that has not happened yet. So far, none of my clients have been bitten by radioactive spiders that I'm aware of, not that they would tell me. Is a lot of their experiences still correlate to real life events in ways that we're going to be talking about in much more detail as we go on. So we look at the fictional stories to understand the real stories, because these stories are still made by humans. And there's something in that subconscious that still gets tapped into. And it turns out there can be a lot of truth in those stories nonetheless. Because really, superheroes, the parent genre, is science fiction. Sometimes fantasy. And this is what science fiction, in my opinion, really does best. Have the coded, subtle, not quite in-your-face discussion about something that's real, something that's actually happening. And in this case, it's embodied psychology. Making sense? Okay, we're about to go into vocabulary territory. I'm going to try and define all my terms. If I miss one and use a word and you have no idea what I'm talking about, raise your hand and I will explain it on the spot so you don't have to wait till the end of the presentation to go, it started with an I think? And you've been using it for 20 minutes and I don't know what it means. So just interrupt me right there and I will try to show my work. There'll be a pop quiz at the end. Okay, the first word, you can find a ton of research on this if you're of a mind to. I really wish we had a slide because that would help you remember the word better, is Introceptive awareness. Introceptive awareness. Say it with me. Introceptive awareness. Okay, Introceptive awareness is a very fancy word for a very simple thing. Introceptive awareness is your ability to get and understand the signals coming from your body. Okay? I skin my knee. The nerves say, oh my gosh, my knee is skinned. Up to the brain. Brain goes, ah yes, our knee is skinned. I don't know why my knee is weak and my brain is weak, but there you go. Now, the next one is a little more difficult, guys. It's proprioception. Proprioception. Well done. Especially for this hour of the morning. And if you're into robotics, you probably already know that word. That word is your awareness of your body parts relative to your other body parts. I can't see my arm right now, but I know I'm sticking it out to the side away from my body. That's why. Okay? Very fancy term for something you do every day, and you have done since you were probably, what, 8 months old? As soon as you were old enough to stop rediscovering your feet and be delighted by it. I think it's kind of a shame I can no longer be delighted by, oh my god, I have feet! Now the last one, you will not find any research on, and that's because I made it up. Yay. Because I kept wanting to have this conversation. Oh! Yay! Okay, so you can see the last word on here is a redefining event. And a redefining event is a term that I use because it was getting to be a mouthful to keep saying an event which has a major impact on the person's relationship to their body. Too long, too much of a mouthful, so redefining event. Okay? An event which drastically impacts a person's relationship to their body. So that's what I mean when I keep using this word. Do not go putting it into Google Scholar. You won't find anything. At least yet. To be honest with you guys, we have a writing sample out to an agent right now. I want to write a book, because this is giving me an hour, and I have at least 300 pages worth of stuff to say. Okay, so let's talk about physical well-being. Because I told you guys that that's one of the areas that's affected by the mind-body relationship, is physical well-being. This is the area, well, of course some of it's intuitive, right? If I don't have good introceptive awareness, I don't know that I'm hungry. So I don't know when to eat. I don't know when I'm full, so I don't know when to stop eating. I don't know when I'm tired, so I don't go to bed. I'm crabby. I don't take care of myself. If my introceptive awareness and my bodily relationship is poor, I'm not going to take very good care of myself. I'm going to tell you guys a little story about that. I have, like I said, I work largely with clients with trauma, and it is amazing to me how many of them will come in my office and they'll do this. And I'll say, hey, how you doing? Fine. You sure? Yeah, everything's going really good. Why would you ask me that? Well, your shoulders are all hunched in and you're kind of hunkered down there and your leg's been bouncing for like 15 minutes at like a hummingbird pulse rate. And this is what happens. They all of a sudden they stop and they look at their legs like they've never seen them before. They're not snarking with me. They didn't realize that their leg was doing that. And that's partly because a lot of my clients have really, really poor introceptive awareness. Okay, really, really bad. So because of that, they're not getting their bodily signals. Now the reason my clients have really poor introceptive awareness for the most part is twofold. One, I work a lot with trauma. And people who've been through trauma, their body keeps sending them panic messages. They don't particularly care to hear. So they kind of try to just sever at the neck, so they don't have to feel those. And the other thing is they're all substance users. I work at a chemical dependency clinic, remember? You know what does a great job of numbing out troubling body signals? Drugs! Just unfortunately, when you stop taking them, sometimes those signals don't come right back. So a lot of them are really learning how to interact with their own body again. Pretty amazing stuff that I would not have thought of had I not got into a late night argument at a big convention about Captain America's sex life. Okay. You don't know what Captain America's sex life is?
No. How does predictability fit in on that last one?
Oh, good point. Okay, predictability. If I have a new situation happen with my body, and it has new needs, I might not know what they are. Okay, you've all probably experienced a small version of this. I am now 32. When I started coming to this convention, it was 17 years ago. I wasn't 32. I could just stay up for 3 days. It was only 3 days then. Yeah, I wouldn't get a hotel room. I'd just stay up for 3 days. I was cheap. I was poor. And each year I had to readjust. How long can I stay up? How long can I do that for?
Oh, yeah.
Turns out by 32, I cannot stay up for 3 days anymore and actually be enjoying myself at Con. Now that, luckily for me, was a slow motion change. I had time to adapt. But when we have faster changes, a lot of times we don't have time to adapt. You ever do this? You have an injury and it starts to feel better and you forget about it. So then you, oh, that's the thing I'm not supposed to do. Because you haven't had time to adapt to that. Okay? So when our body has changes, it becomes more difficult to understand what it's going to need from us. So it becomes harder to take care of. Does that make sense? All right. Now this is the one where people get a little confused. Emotional well-being. People usually go, well, I know when I'm scared. I know when I'm angry. Well, good. How? Remember my client who didn't realize they weren't fine? They're not lying to me. They really don't. Because they cut off things like noticing their heart rate, noticing their muscle tension. I put it this way, if someone calls you 100 times a day, always with bad news, you would stop picking up the phone. Okay, so they have stopped picking up the phone. And as a result, they often don't know what their feelings are. Okay? So we think of Bruce Banner here. His well-being, and the well-being of everyone around him, is actually dependent on him being aware of his emotional state at all times. And if you remember in the Hulk movie, he actually had a little heart rate monitor. It appears that introceptive awareness did not come easily to Mr. Banner. He likes to live up here, not down here. So he got himself a little heart rate monitor to help him notice, hey Bruce, you're freaking out. Might want to settle down. So your emotional well-being is rooted in your body. Okay, you don't just know you're afraid or angry because you know. You're actually getting the signals from your body. And it turns out people who've had paralysis, where they're not getting their signals from their torso and such, often report really blunted feelings to a really kind of awful degree because they don't get excited about things anymore. They don't get their feelings nearly as intensely. Now, it's not that they're completely gone, because they still have their head, but the feelings get really blunted. And a lot of people have really complained about that as being one of the kind of undisclosed, undiscussed side effects of certain health conditions. This is my favorite picture. In case you can't tell, that is Steve Rogers not having updated his body maps, crashing through a wedding store window because he doesn't know how to bank a turn on his fancy new 6-foot odd body.
Does it come up in the discussion about sex life?
Actually, yes. Because my argument was basically that after going from my height to 6 foot, and he put on at least 100 pounds there, got rid of his asthma, so the signals from his lungs were different, got rid of his heart arrhythmia, so the signals from his heart were different. After all of that, he probably would have really terrible Introceptive awareness for a while, which makes sex really hard, because you kind of need to know your bodily signals for that. And this was part of my argument, was like, dude can't even run. Okay? You want him to do something as introceptively saturated as that? No, give the guy a little time to adapt, for Pete's sake. Okay, so this is dependent on updated body maps. Now, a lot of us in this room, we've had trouble with this in the past when our body changed faster than our body map could accommodate. Remember puberty?
Oh yeah.
Remember that growth spurt where suddenly you were all knees and elbows? Your body map, lucky. Your body map hadn't updated fast enough for your growth spurt, especially if you had a quick growth spurt. Like your brother, that was creepy. He grew like 6 inches one summer. It was weird. He knocked over everything. Or if you've ever gained or lost weight suddenly. Okay, you've seen this, someone who's lost a lot of weight, all of a sudden they're edging around things and like leaving an extra whole huge band of space around them because they still feel like they're bigger than they are. That's part of the reason actually if people lose weight, they look in the mirror, they don't see it. They literally don't see it because their body map hasn't updated. And your eyes are not nearly as objective as we like to pretend that they are. Or someone who's recently gained a bunch of weight and they're knocking into things all the time, they don't realize that they're bigger yet. Their body map hasn't updated. Which is hilarious because actually neurologically your body map can update very, very quickly. If you want the weirdest example to me is if you drive and you've gone into a low garage, right? And you're going in this low garage and you're sitting in your car and you hunch down. You hunch down so the ceiling doesn't hit your head. Human beings, primates in general, actually have an amazing ability to adapt their body map to include tools. It's part of what's so cool about us. When you see in those kung fu movies, you must become one with your sword. That's not hooey, that's people's body maps will actually adapt to accommodate a tool that they're very, very accustomed to. Like the car, like a sword, like a tennis racket. Your body map literally changes and we can actually see that on brain scans. How cool is that? It takes a while. But our brain is capable of amazing, amazing plasticity when it comes to what our body map is. However, it tends to adapt temporarily and then reset. Which is why sometimes things like weight loss that have happened can take a little while to adapt to. Okay. This is a really emerging field that we don't have as much data on yet, but is really exciting. Okay, so we all know your memories are stored in your brain, okay? And that's accurate and that's true, fine. But it turns out accessing them is not entirely a brain thing. We sort of know this. You know that smell that suddenly you're 6 again? For me, it's orange floor cleaner and crayon. All of a sudden I'm back at Tuttle Marcy and I missed it. But there's an emerging amount of data saying that bodily sensation also can be really tied to memory, which is something we really haven't discussed too much yet with people who've had a major body alteration. How's that going to affect your memory retrieval? Massage therapists will tell you that now and then they'll just press on somebody's shoulder blade and all of a sudden they'll either break out into hysterical laughter or break down crying because they triggered a memory. Some other time where there was some pressure in that one spot and it's all back. Really interesting stuff. You know, everyone talks about Bucky Barnes' terrible memory, but we never occurred to us that part of the reason is probably that his body maps are all discombobulated. Okay? So reconfiguring senses and reconfiguring body map can actually impact memory. Trauma does this. At my work we do something called Tai Chi. You know what that is? And part of the reason they have me go co-facilitate that, even though I'm not a Tai Chi expert, is that sometimes clients will be moving their body in a certain novel, unusual way and get a trauma trigger. Happened just a few weeks ago. A lady she was doing bass drum and all of a sudden she started crying because something about the leg stance triggered a trauma memory. So I'm basically on call in the Tai Chi group in case someone has a trigger. And they're very potent triggers when it's in the body, for reasons that we'll talk about when we talk a little bit more about trauma. Okay, so I promised I would talk about adaptation, so let's talk about what I even mean by the word adapt, because that's actually pretty vague. So I broke it down into 5 pieces. Understanding the new Introceptive signals, right? So Steve Rogers has to get used to the fact that his lungs feel different now. His emotional signals feel different. Changing health habits to accommodate different needs. I would venture to guess that Beast's eating habits need to change. Just a thought. I don't know if he's going to eat kibble or what. But he needs to be able to adapt to figure out what his new body needs. It comes back down to predictability. Do I know what my body needs now? Especially if I don't know how to understand these signals, I might not. Updating mental maps so you don't crash through store windows. Very important. Updating the subjective sense of identity. Okay, so this is the kind of visible denial piece. This is the, no, I'm not going to be a mutant. I don't have to be a mutant. No, I didn't have an amputation. Oh, I guess I did. Okay, updating the body map so that that becomes part of identity. And then just a psychological acceptance of bodily state. Can I say with some level of comfort, yes, this is where my body is at? So I'm not in denial. My dad does this. Okay, he doesn't want to admit sometimes that his back can't do that anymore. Okay, so he needs to update that, which is hard because things keep changing. These meat bags, they won't stay put. So I've broken down, for understanding sake, into types of redefining events. And the way I organized this was around trauma. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The first being, that's like the first thing psychology got around to properly studying. Okay? It's one of the most studied subjects in all of the field of psychology is trauma. So, okay, I'm kind of cheating here, to be honest with you. We don't have a lot of the data I want, so I'm leaning on the data we do have. But that's not without reason. There's a lot of important connection here. So, things we do know about trauma is that it's not just about the bad thing that happened. They're what we call resiliency factors. Awesome, you're still awake. And some of those are having agency and having a sense of control. Okay? 2 people are in a bus accident. One of them manages to help get people to safety. The other one is trapped, can't move, and is unable to help anyone. We know that that second person has a much higher chance of having lasting psychological problems from the trauma than the first person. Because they were trapped, they didn't get to have their agency, they weren't able to grab a sense of control out of the situation. That's important. Trauma affects the body long after injuries are healed. We know it affects the mind, right? We kind of are there as a society, but it also affects the body. We'll talk about that. different types of trauma have different prognoses, which is basically how are your odds. Okay? Human or alien or android-based traumas are more likely to produce lasting psychological problems than forces of nature. One of the groups I've worked with is refugees of Katrina, which is a huge natural disaster. And universally, the hurricane was bad. That was scary and they didn't like it. But the thing that was clinging to them and causing the ongoing trauma was what the people were doing after the hurricane. Okay, these we know are the things that are more likely to cause psychological damage. There's also a change versus developmental versus mature onset. How old were you? Was this your whole childhood? That you were, secretly a mutant and afraid that someone would find out? Or was it adult onset of a trauma? Unfortunately, I do not have time to get a whole lot into that, but there will be a bibliography at the end for sources you can look up if you're more interested later. Okay, so here's how I broke it down. We've got voluntary. I sought out this redefining event. I looked for it. We've got coerced. I took agency in a situation that I did not want and took control that way. Accidental. Whoops. I have accident. Developmental. Puberty. Okay. Discovered. The body didn't actually change, but my relationship to it did. And forced. Everybody else. Superhero stories really like that one, and I have some theories about that. I did not ask for this, I did not want this, I did not want to be a genetically modified raccoon. Okay. Let's first talk about our best case scenario, and that's voluntary. So here we've got Steve. Now we would generally expect, no big shock here, that the redefining event that was asked for is probably the one that's going to cause the less psychological distress. I asked for the thing, I got the thing. Not too traumatic, one hopes, as long as everything goes right. So you have the highest expected level of accountability. You asked for this, here's for the thing. If you have side effects, boo-hoo, cry me a river, you asked for the thing. That's how society tends to treat this. Interestingly, this is most common in our villains, not our heroes. There's not a whole lot like Steve. And I think that a lot of that is because we're very suspicious of people wanting to change their bodies. We kind of give them a pass if it falls under the range of normal. Well, they're just trying to be normal. I've never met anyone who really is normal in every dimension, even physically, but there you go. So it's okay to have reconstructive surgery because you're trying to get normal. But as soon as you start wanting to do something that puts you outside the kind of the norm, we get suspicious. And I don't think it's completely unfair that people are a little like, why do you want a cyborg arm that can crush steel? That makes me a little uncomfortable as your neighbor.
So where do you get these cyborg arms that you crush?
They're in development.
Arnim Zola, apparently. Okay, so this is most common in our villains. Killian from Iron Man 3, Red Skull, obviously. Our villains seek out power. Our heroes, they have to just rise to the occasion. And that's part of the stigma around certain kinds of body alterations, particularly those associated with, for example, gender affirmation surgeries. Okay? Even though male and female are both nominally normal, wanting to switch between the two, our society still deems abnormal, so why would you want to do that? Why would you do that? That's weird. Even though what that person is really doing is trying to improve their Introceptive experience to make what's going on down here and what's going on up here match up. Our society has stigma against changing parts of your body unless it's just to be normal. So that's voluntary. And we have coerced. So it's still, you've got a much higher risk of psychological trauma in this case, but since there's an element of grabbing control, the prognosis is still not bad. Tony Stark took 4 movies to get PTSD? That's pretty good. I think that's pretty good. Middle level of social accountability, because we do give people some slack when, you're in a bad situation. Real life examples, most of medicine falls under this category. Nobody really is excited to get a continuous flow heart valve unless their heart is already failing. So if you have some side effects, well, you know, it is what it is. You had to get that heart valve to survive. Obviously you didn't want it, so we cut people some slack. You know, Tony it was not his idea to get a bunch of shrapnel in his chest, but the arc reactor was his idea, which is kind of the point of at least the first movie. Accidental. Here we got Peter Parker being bit by a spider. Again, because there's not a human responsible, lower levels of trauma, because it's a force of nature. Now, I have to mention this. The limit of each of these categories, because you might notice they're kind of blurry. Was it an accident or was it somebody's fault? That is the exact same size and shape as the person experiencing it. Okay, so if they really want to blame somebody, then psychologically it will be like forced or coerced. If they really don't want to blame somebody, it could be accidental. We don't know if Tony Stark thinks of his as voluntary or coerced. Okay, this is me adding these labels. So real life examples, actual accidents. Okay, developmental. Now this is one we've all had. We remember parts of it better than others. Babies have a lot of this all the time. Oh my God, my feet. Oh my God, solid foods. Oh my God, hiccuping. I don't remember doing that before. That's crazy. The accountability for changes during this are pretty random. And just this is where all of society's random stigmas and judgments and all that just kind of pop up. This is your fault, but that isn't. Weight gain is, even though you're growing, but acne isn't, unless it is because you eat greasy foods. Okay, we get a lot of blaming going on with a lot of these developmental. Unlike some of the others, things that come up developmentally, like the X-Men getting their powers at puberty, if it comes up developmentally, we assume it to be part of the true nature of a person. So it becomes even less about accountability and more about who you are as a person. Which is why it's so easy to judge the X-Men. Well, that's who they are. It's not an accident, by the way, that we have a lot of these redefining events happening at puberty. Oh, that's when you find out you have superpowers. And it's not just to sell comic books to teenagers. It's because there's already so many and so constant alterations to the body at that age that it strikes a chord with a lot of us. Oh yeah, I remember not being able to manage my own knees and elbows at that age. Sure, I guess it would be hard to manage I-beams. An element of familiarity with that. Then there's the discovered type. And the body doesn't change for this one. It's the experience and relationship to the body that change. Loki has always been secretly a frost giant. But he just found that out at the tender age of 5,000. Again, so just like with developmental, it's assumed to be reflective of identity, which is part of what's kind of putting Loki off the rails here. Because if that's always who you were, then that calls into question your body and your entire history. The other complicating factor with discovered redefining events is there can be an element of secrecy. Did somebody know and they weren't telling you? Okay, so is this something where you have to reshuffle your whole identity and someone knew this whole time and weren't telling you? You aware of how well Loki handled that? Okay, real life has corollaries of this, and the two best, the first one that I came up with was adoption status. Kind of the easy one because I'm starting off with Loki, right? As a person who is waiting actually to adopt an infant, I've studied a lot about what's best for adopted kids, and it turns out now that the best thing very much is for them to know right from the get-go that they're adopted. Otherwise they get upset later. Generally not to this point.
We don't want any revenge stories in the family.
But if you've been hiding it, there's an automatic element of shame. Why didn't you tell me? This must be a bad thing. This must be a shameful thing. So that means where I actually came from, my origin, is a bad, shameful thing. That is not a thought that fits comfortably in anyone's head. Okay, which is good. Now they're very much moving more towards what we call open adoption, where people know that they're adopted right from the get-go, and ideally even have like at least a minimal little bit of contact with their biological parent, where they can see their own body mirrored. All those little quirks that I will not share with my child, someone else will, so that they can see their own body and get more of that predictability piece. Oh, what runs in the family? The other one, I thought this was great. Someone actually suggested the last time I did this presentation was intersex status. Now for those who don't know, intersex is a word that describes one of 15, all of 15 different conditions that make a body be biologically somewhere between those two supposedly binary sexes, male, female. Well, no. Turns out there's at least 15 ways to physically be not one or the other of those strictly in a binary. Okay? Some of those you won't find out until puberty or until trying to have kids. Others, though, are visible from the get-go. Baby comes out and the doctor says it's a baby. Because we're conditioned in this society to assign a binary. And for a long time, the thought with that was, okay, well, quick give them surgery. Quick give them surgery so they never have to know. We're back to the shameful secret. I came out wrong. I came out bad. They have to do massive plastic surgery on me as an infant. I was so messed up. And when it comes to something that has a lot to do with identity, like sex and gender, that's a bitter pill for a lot of folks to swallow. So intersex is another one like this, where again, the body isn't changed, but if my parents were hiding my intersex status from me, and I find out later, that would be a discovered type redefining event. Okay, finally we have our worst case scenario, and that is the forced redefining event. Okay, I didn't ask for this, I didn't want this, I never needed to be a cyborg assassin, thank you. But here we are. I was really disturbed, by the way, at the number of female characters that had this type of redefining event. Thanks, comics. Highest level of psychological trauma. Kind of fits in with what we've been saying. Supposedly the lowest levels of accountability. I feel like in practice we're not always so good about that, because if something is really awful, we want someone, we kind of don't want to accept that that could just happen to a person. And there's a reason that these are so common. And that is because assault and sexual assault are pretty common in our society. So that our fiction would reflect that is not too shocking, really. So we have a lot of that in our comics, movies. So let's talk about the actual effect of trauma for a moment.
Question.
Yes?
Do you category like the development of like the chronic illness would fall into? Would that be more like accidental or?
I would say that would be accidental or discovered, depending on how the person interprets it. So if it's, oh, this was lurking in my genes the whole time, it might be discovered. Otherwise, I would probably usually put that under accidental. We're going to get to questions in a couple minutes. So trauma in the body. Trauma does not just affect your body once. It's not just now you're a super assassin, the end. Okay? Because your body and mind are in constant bidirectional communication, remember. And what happens is the alarm system in your body and in your mind often does one of two things after severe trauma. It goes into overdrive. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Or shuts down. Radio silence. Both of those have their problems. So when the alarm system goes into overdrive, your sympathetic nervous system is on constant watch for an attack. It is at the ready to run from a tiger or whatever. It's not really sure what's going on, but it's ready. Racing heart. Immune system turns off. Gastrointestinal system turns off. Healing systems off. We are on emergency systems only. We are ready for fight or flight. A good thing in a crisis. If it doesn't turn off though, you're in trouble because you need those. You need an immune system, as it turns out. Those are useful. Cortisol pattern sets in, and basically makes a long-term effect like adrenaline. And that will make it so that these things continue to go on. So long-term effects, all the stuff that happens when these go on for too long. Okay, not good for your health. Mentally, hypervigilance, that's another one of our term. It's what it sounds like. You're vigilant and then you're hypervigilant. Okay, you're always on the lookout for danger. And because of that, remember I said cognitive stuff was impacted by the body? It's not just that lack of sleep. Hypervigilance causes irritability, poor focus, and poor memory. And that's because your system is being devoted to finding and dealing with threats. It doesn't have time for reminiscing about second grade. Don't you realize we could be under attack at any moment? So it can really affect how your mind is working, because your mind actually is prioritizing. And this good stuff in the front is not really doing what it normally would be doing. It's focusing on your fight or flight response. And then a high risk of drug seeking to reduce emotional reactivity. I can't live like this. I can't live being scared all the time. Where's a bottle? Okay, this is how a lot of my clients wound up coming to me. They couldn't take this constant emotional barrage, and so they found something to numb it out, which just shut off their Introceptive signals and caused a new problem, but... And then there's when the alarm system shuts down. These are my clients who continue to get into dangerous situations, who don't seem to understand cause and effect. Well, yeah, you're getting evicted because you didn't pay your rent. Now you're homeless. Scary. Their alarm system has shut down. Okay? The smoke detector went off for so long it ran out of batteries. So because of that, they're not able to associate things that are risky, they're dangerous. And that again comes from the body. The fear response is absent. That elevated heart rate doesn't happen. So numbness, loss of pleasure, loss of interest. If this looks like DSM qualifications for PTSD, there's a reason for that. I have one friend of mine who I've been working with who has so many reasons to have bad interoception. Major medical complications, trauma history, substance use history. And his system is so shut down. I was making him a costume for CONvergence actually. I put a piece of cardboard in front of his face. I said, point to your eyes so I can put an eye hole in. Couldn't do it. Without being able to see his fingers, his body map was to the point where he couldn't even find his own eyes when he wasn't looking at his fingers. Now that's kind of on the extreme end. You know, my 2-year-old godson can do that. He can point to his eyes. But when things are really shut down, that's what happens. Okay, real quick, a couple other factors. We're going to breeze through these so I can give you guys time for questions. Community and social factors. So sometimes a redefining event can bring you in line with a community. Like frost giants or X-Men, which you may want in the case of some X-Men, or not want in the case of Loki. There are real life redefining events. The multiple sclerosis community is actually quite vast and well connected. The transgender community is another one that is very much a community that you can choose to be a part of if you have had this sort of redefining event. Others may be isolating, like Bruce Banner. He's the only one. He's the only one, well, unless you get into Red Hulk and Grey Hulk and all of those. But in the MCU, he's pretty much the only one that's really like him. Beast, only one really like him. If Beast needs to go to the doctor, where is he going to go? Seriously. Does he go to a doctor? Does he go to a vet? He doesn't know. If you're different, or if you have a combination of factors that make you different, finding that community of support can be really, really difficult. And finally, this could be a whole presentation by itself, but I have 10 minutes. Privilege and stigma. Steve Rogers has a lot less stigma associated with his redefining event than Beast does. Steve Rogers went hot. Beast just went hairy and blue. Okay, so redefining events impact stigma and privilege, and they also are impacted by stigma and privilege. Tony Stark can afford, I use this picture on purpose, this is him telling off the United States government. He can get away with that. Okay, if Deathlock tried that, it would not go over well for him. Okay, he doesn't have that kind of clout, he doesn't have that kind of societal privilege. And he has more stigma because he's more visibly cybernetic and more visibly weaponized, even though he is just as weaponized. He is treated very differently. Okay, want to know more? Here's some of my sources, guys. Most of what I talked about today and a whole lot more, including some really cool stuff on body maps that I just got in recently, is in these. So we got 2 books, The Body Keeps the Score. This talks a lot about trauma. We've got The Body Has a Mind of Its Own. That talks a lot about body maps. Okay. And then Stage of Change Theory is actually just about how people adapt to changes. And I wanted to present to you about stages of change theory, but it just wouldn't fit, because that's like a 2-hour presentation all by itself. But that's the actual process of how do we adapt. I told you what's necessary for adaptation. But that's talking about how we actually do it, because it's not an on-off switch. Okay, it's steps. There's 5 steps. I don't have time to tell you about it because I want to leave time for questions. Who's got questions? Yeah, your hands. Okay, you've been waiting the longest, sir, in the back.
I was curious about the, could you get into more detail about the differences between accidental and forced?
Okay. So the question was about the difference between accidental and forced. So I'm going to remind you guys, these categories are fuzzy and subjective. So it really comes down to the interpretation of the person affected. Do I want to blame someone or not? And psychologically, remember, with trauma we know when we're blaming a person, when there's a human being, or alien or android or whatever, that caused our problem, the trauma is bigger. Because that's when our ability to trust people is affected. And one of the best things for trauma is healing relationships. So if something doesn't mess up my ability to have healing relationships with other people, I'm going to expect my rate of trauma to be lower. If I ascribe it to an accident or a spider, I'm likely to have less psychological trauma because it's not going to give me that wariness against people. I might be arachnophobic, or I might have a dislike radiation and gamma rays. That has not been included in the MCU, but I would expect that. So that's kind of the main gap between those two, is the assignment of blame. Hands again, who we got? Yes?
Would you care to comment on the jar and how a person might adapt to having their body?
So the question is, how might someone adapt to having their body and their brain completely separated? The thing is, we actually know about that because functionally, that's what happens when you have total body paralysis and numbness. Okay, functionally, you do not have any more bodily signals. Now, it's not that people can't live that way, because they do. It's not that you can't have a life, but emotions are going to be very, very blunted. Remember I talked about continuous flow heart valves? That's a heart valve that cycles your blood, but you no longer have a pulse. You're alive, but you don't have a pulse, and even that causes a level of emotional numbness that people do complain about. So the more we're missing, particularly the abdomen, we can kind of do without the limbs. They don't do as much of the emoting. They do some. My hands are really sweaty right now. Okay, my heart rate is going. That's my nerves, that's my adrenaline for public speaking. But a lot of the emotion is actually down here in the torso. So if you are a brain in a jar, you're going to have pretty blunted emotions. And your emotions are there to motivate you. Fear exists to tell you, run. Okay, so that signal is going to be dimmer. Okay? Next hand. Blue shirt. You were on blue shirt.
Going back to the previous question, I just wanted to touch on an aspect of force. When you were saying that it has to be a person, it has to be someone that you can blame to. Just clarification, that person can be yourself. You can feel like you force yourself and not even trust your own emotions anymore. Or would that fall under a different category?
Oh, okay, so that really comes down to kind of what your existing relationship was with yourself beforehand. If I blame myself personally, I do it in a different way than if I blame somebody else. Okay, because I didn't hold myself at gunpoint. Okay, I didn't do that. It might be, I think Tony Stark has a little bit of that, because he blames himself for his weapons being there in the first place. But in his case, it's still coerced. I didn't want to do this, but I took charge. So it kind of comes down to how much do you feel like you were able to grab some agency in the situation? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Hands again?
Yeah, it's up for a while.
Who, which, red shirt?
Red shirt.
Red shirt.
Now, I know that they are starting to experiment with haptic feedback in prosthetics.
Yes.
To what extent does that help people actually rebuild their interoception? And are you aware of any experimentation with non-limb assistive devices also getting that kind of feedback? Like scooters and mobility aids for the paralyzed getting feedback mechanisms?
We're not there yet. I think we'll get there. Most people who have a scooter, their body map already accommodates it. They can't physically get sensation from it. Have you ever done this? You drop something on your shoe. It didn't actually hit your foot. You go, ow! Your shoe is part of your body map in that moment, even though it doesn't have sensory awareness. Currently, yes, we have prosthetics that are working on, it's still very crude, but we're working on, and it's definitely coming, that have sensation. Okay, that have that can give neurological feedback. They can feel things. Bucky Barnes has one. He's the only one. So that's definitely in production. Right now, I think the next frontier is going to be organs. And I don't know if we're going to do that, because if we get to 3D printing them first, we probably won't have the need for doing biological ones that can give that kind of feedback that interacts with the emotion side. I kind of hope we do, just because more options is more better. I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. Brown suit?
So, okay. Could you go back to the recommended slide?
Oh, yeah.
Just so I can-
Wait, I got to stop. There.
Awesome.
There it is.
And then the second one was actually no.
Wrong one.
So you mentioned a paper at the beginning, and I'm
Yes.
actually really curious about that. Is there any way that we could access and read that, or is that
It's on my Archive of Your Own account. I'm not leading to that on my YouTube page about this subject, but come and find me after the panel,
okay?
and I would be happy to direct you in that direction. Okay, one more question. Glasses guy.
What about memory or lack of memory, like say Wolverine? How does that affect trauma?
Ah, okay, so this is the fun thing. This book is called The Body Keeps the Score, and that's for a reason. Whether you remember the trauma or not does not necessarily impact whether your body does or not. Okay? Repressed memories, although nothing like all that satanic panic in the, what was it, the 90s? Yeah. Repressed memories are a thing. People with trauma will sometimes even practice forgetting things, or they could have a concussion, because traumatic memories are actually stored differently in the brain, and they're mostly stored, instead of in a nice linear progression, although most people with trauma eventually learn how to sort of write that script, is mostly held in terms of sensory information, and because of that, the cues are even more likely to be sensory input, like physical input, which is why someone who even doesn't remember their trauma might be really, really upset by somebody grabbing their wrist in a certain way that reminds them of the trauma. And they may or may not know why that is, or sometimes that can be the reason why they remember why that is. Okay, especially if the trauma happened very, very young, which it sometimes does. And guys, I'm sorry you're officially out of time, Pip. You know where you can ask me stuff later.
It was just follow up to Wolverine.
Okay.
It's like how Wolverine has memory loss, and at one point it seems like he doesn't remember he has these giant metal claws in his hands, but he knows how to bring them out just automatically.
That is a beautiful example of, muscle memory. That's a beautiful example of comics figuring something out before psychology. All right, thank you everybody.